So many of us operate under this deeply ingrained assumption about how the modern world works.
Right, like a universally accepted blueprint.
Exactly. We tend to believe that if a nation wants to climb out of poverty, join the ranks of the wealthy, industrialized world, there's a globally approved checklist.
You privatize state-owned enterprises, you tear down tariff walls, open up to free trade.
Yeah, and you welcome foreign direct investment with open arms. I mean, the logic seems totally unassailable. You expose your local industries to global competition, they're forced to get efficient, and bam, your economy skyrockets.
It's the Washington Consensus. By the late 20th century, global institutions treated this less like a theory and more like, well, a law of physics.
Which brings us to the really jarring contradiction at the heart of today's deep dive. I'm your host, and with me is our resident economic expert. Our mission today is to look at a country that took that exact blueprint and executed it flawlessly.
I mean, they did everything right. They brought in the technocrats, sold off the state assets, signed historic free trade agreements.
By all conventional logic, they should have had this massive economic miracle. But instead, they got 2 decades of just agonizing stagnation.
Yeah.
A completely flatlining economy.
And we're dissecting a really landmark paper on this. It's a 2010 paper from the National Bureau of Economic Research by economists Timothy J. Kehoe and Kim J. Ruhl.
And the title is just a blunt question, right?
Yeah, it's literally, why have economic reforms in Mexico not generated growth?
Yeah.
And the authorship is what makes this so wild.
Right, because Kehoe wasn't some anti-globalization critic throwing stones from the outside.
Not at all. In the 90s, Professor Kehoe was a passionate, vocal advocate for these exact Mexican reforms. He championed them.
He essentially wrote the prescription, watched the patient take the medicine, and then realized the patient wasn't getting any stronger.
Exactly. So now, using this massive, rigorous data set, he and Ruhl are doing an autopsy to figure out why.
And to really grasp the scale of this mystery, we can't just look at Mexico in a vacuum. We have to compare it to the ultimate economic juggernaut of our time.
We have to look at China.
Right. By putting Mexico and China side by side during the exact same time frame, we're going to uncover this hidden mechanism, like an iron law of global growth that completely rewrites how you should think about wealth and efficiency.
The stakes here are huge for anyone trying to understand the global economy. Both countries initiated massive opening phases at basically the same time. One stalled, and one altered the gravity of the entire world.
Okay, so to set the baseline, let's talk about Mexico's commitment, because the 1980s were just brutal for the Mexican economy.
This is incredibly brutal. Between 1982 and 85, they endured a severe debt crisis.
And the old model, they had this inward-looking, highly protectionist system where the government shielded local industries. It had just visibly collapsed.
Yeah, so the government realized they had to pivot. They launched what they call the apertura, or the opening.
And this wasn't a half measure.
No, it was a total dismantling of decades of doctrine. They slashed tariffs, eliminated import quotas, and started heavily privatizing government-operated firms.
Pushing them into the private sector so the free market could, force them to be ruthlessly efficient. And the crown jewel of all this was in 1994.
NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
The psychological impact of NAFTA was just massive. It wasn't just a trade deal. It was like a geopolitical marriage. Mexico was binding its economic destiny to the U.S. and Canada.
The global consensus was totally euphoric. Everyone thought, well, they are integrating with the largest economy on Earth, so they'll inevitably get pulled up into the first world.
The theory was bulletproof, right?
Yeah.
You remove barriers, foreign companies build factories inside your borders, they bring advanced tech, productivity goes up, and your gross domestic product climbs.
That was the promise. And they didn't fake these reforms. The tariffs actually dropped. The borders opened.
Wait, if they followed the blueprint perfectly, why are we doing a deep dive on their stagnation? Did the blueprint lie?
That is the multi-trillion-dollar question. To understand how bad the stagnation was, we need our control group. Let's look at China, starting from that same post-1985 window.
Okay, lay the numbers on us, because this is where the divergence gets crazy.
We're looking at a very specific, pure metric, real GDP per working age person. This controls for inflation and population changes.
So it's just a raw look at how much economic value the average worker is actually creating.
Exactly. From 1985 to 2008, China's real GDP per working age person exploded by 510%.
510%? That's insane.
It breaks down to an average compounding growth rate of 8.2% every single year. a sustained hyper-growth miracle.
Okay, now give us the data for Mexico over that exact same 23-year period.
Mexico's real GDP per working-age person grew by a total of 10%.
Wait, 10% total, not per year.
Over 2 decades.
Wow.
10% total. That's an annualized growth rate of 0.4%.
Wow. So while China's leaping forward at over 8% a year, Mexico is just completely frozen.
The gap between those two outcomes is a 50 times multiplier. Not 50%, 50 times.
It's like two cars entering the same highway at the exact same time. One hits 100 miles per hour and the other is just stuck in first gear.
Right. And common sense says, well, the fast car must have a better engine. Or, in economic terms, China must have just been a more open economy.
Yeah, you'd assume China embraced global trade way better. They must have exported more, attracted more foreign money.
Right.
Wrong.
The data completely destroys that assumption. It is the ultimate slap in the face to conventional wisdom.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah. When Kehoe and Ruhl ran the trade and foreign direct investment numbers, Mexico and China initially look identical. Mexico's trade as a percentage of GDP skyrocketed right alongside China's.
Okay, let's put some numbers to that so people can really visualize it.
In 1995, China accounted for 12.7% of all merchandise trade from emerging markets. They were number one.
And who was number two?
Mexico, at 7.0%.
Wait, so they were right behind them.
Yes. And it's even more striking with foreign direct investment, or FDI. This is the physical cash foreign corporations spend to build actual factories inside a country.
Okay, so who was winning the FDI race in 95?
China was number one, absorbing 33.4% of emerging market FDI, and Mexico was again number two, capturing 8.5%.
So Mexico was wildly successful at attracting global capital. The doors were open, the cash poured in, the factories got built.
They had the exact same high-performance fuel pumping into their economy as China. But by 2008, things looked very different.
What happened?
China was still dominating, but Mexico's share of FDI collapsed. They plummeted down to 7th place, capturing only 3.2%. They got passed by Brazil, Russia, India.
Why did the capital just pack up and flee if the doors were still wide open? NAFTA was still there?
That capital flight exposes this huge flaw in how we think about trade. If both countries open their doors and both got massive floods of trade and cash, then open trade cannot be the engine of GDP growth.
Which creates so much cognitive dissonance. I mean, the whole premise of free trade deals is that lowering tariffs boosts your GDP. Politicians say it all the time.
Politicians say it, yes, but standard economic theory, it actually doesn't even claim that trade openness guarantees GDP growth.
Wait, hold on. Lowering tariffs doesn't guarantee your GDP will go up?
No. In fact, under certain conditions, textbook international trade models like the Ricardian models, they say your real GDP might actually go down.
Are you serious? A politician would get last out of the room if they tried to sell a trade agreement by saying it might lower the nation's GDP?
Absolutely. Because the models aren't promising an increase in domestic production. They are promising an increase in national welfare.
Okay, break that down for us. What is the difference between GDP and national welfare?
GDP is just production. It's the physical volume of stuff made inside your borders. National welfare measures the standard of living, the actual purchasing power of your citizens.
So production versus consumption. I guess a country could produce less physical stuff, but if the stuff they import becomes drastically cheaper, the citizens are technically wealthier.
Exactly. Their paychecks stretch further. And this dynamic is captured by something called the terms of trade premium.
Terms of trade, that's the ratio of export prices to import prices, right?
Yes. It measures the purchasing power of your exports. If the global price of the electronics Mexico imports goes down, their terms of trade improve. They get more foreign goods for the exact same amount of domestic labor.
It's like an invisible raise for the whole country. The physical output is flat, but the reward for that output multiplies. So did Mexico get this invisible raise?
They did. Kehoe and Ruhl found Mexico experienced a sustained improvement in its terms of trade. They gained a hidden purchasing power boost, averaging 0.17% per year.
So you're telling me Mexico's citizens actually got richer in a way that global GDP scoreboards completely missed?
Yes, and here is where it gets really interesting. Let's look at China's terms of trade during that same period.
During their 510% GDP explosion, did their purchasing power go up?
No, it actually deteriorated.
Yeah.
China flooded the world with manufactured goods, which drove down the global prices of their own exports.
Oh, wow. So they were working harder, producing exponentially more stuff, but getting less value back from the rest of the world for every unit they shipped.
Exactly. Because of that, China's GDP growth actually overstates their real income growth by almost 8 percentage points over the decade.
That is fascinating. The global scoreboard was artificially inflating China's success while totally hiding Mexico's subtle gains.
And that's just the terms of trade. The paper goes even deeper into consumer welfare, using something called the Feestra method.
Okay, I love this part. This is something every single person experiences but never thinks about mathematically. What is the Feenstra method?
Robert Feenstra created a way to calculate the invisible welfare gains from new products varieties. Traditional inflation metrics just track a fixed basket of goods, like the price of a generic gallon of milk or a generic car.
But free trade doesn't just lower the price of a generic car. It brings in cars that never existed in that country before.
Right. Before the Apertura, Mexican consumers had a very limited, highly protected market. Trade liberalization brought an explosion of specific choices.
And having a choice actually has economic value.
Huge value. The researchers looked at 154 distinct categories of imported goods. They used these granular 6-digit harmonized system codes.
So they weren't just looking at the broad category of coffee.
No, they were tracking specific Colombian roasts versus Costa Rican roasts. If a consumer prefers a specific imported tool over the generic domestic one, simply having that option acts as an effective price drop.
Because they're getting exactly what they want without having to spend more money to compensate for a subpar product. So what was the actual magnitude of this variety dividend in Mexico?
It was massive. From 1990 to 2000, just having access to new varieties effectively dropped Mexico's import prices by 6%.
6%, just from variety.
Yeah. And when you convert that into a welfare equivalent, Mexican consumers gained an additional 1.42% of their 1990 income.
Just purely from the introduction of variety. And how did China compare?
Chinese consumers only gained a 1.01% welfare equivalent from new varieties.
Okay, so let's tally this up. The final welfare balance sheet. Because initially, the raw GDP numbers look like a disaster for Mexico.
Right. But when you add the terms of trade premium and the Feenstra variety dividend, Mexico's real income per capita actually grew by 2.09% annually.
Which is noticeably higher than their disappointing 1.7% GDP growth.
And for China, it works in reverse. When you adjust for welfare, their growth drops from 8.99% down to 8.33%.
So trade actually worked for Mexico's consumers. The policies did exactly what the academic models promised: better purchasing power and welfare.
The consumer won big, but, and this is a massive pistiff, but an economy cannot survive on consumption alone.
Right, because even with the adjustments, 2.09% real income growth is still dwarfed by China's 8.33%. The gap is still huge.
Exactly. The overall engine of production in Mexico was still completely stalled out.
So if trade openness and foreign capital don't dictate production growth, what does? Capital and labor are just the raw ingredients.
And the real magic is the recipe. And Mexico somehow completely lost its cookbook.
Okay, let's unpack that, because this brings us to the ultimate variable. To figure out the difference, we have to look at the neoclassical growth model.
Specifically, the Cobb-Douglas production function.
Right. And I promise the listeners no heavy math, so we're just going to explain the concepts. The equation is y equals a times k to the power of alpha times L to the power of 1 minus alpha.
It sounds dense, but it's super intuitive. Y is your total economic output, the total goods and services produced.
And k is capital, the physical assets, ovens, factories, delivery trucks.
Yep. And L is labor, the workforce. How many bakers are in the kitchen?
If we're running a bakery, the most obvious way to make more bread is to buy more ovens and hire more bakers. Brute force.
But you eventually hit a ceiling doing that. Which brings us to A, the most critical variable, total factor productivity, or TFP.
So if K and L are the ingredients, A is the recipe. It's the layout of the kitchen, the efficiency of the management.
It's the magical variable that lets you make more bread without buying a single new oven or hiring a new baker. It's your society's pure operational efficiency.
So to understand the 50 times divergence, we have to look at the TFP data. Let's start with China. A lot of people assume China's boom was just brute force, cheap labor.
That's a huge misconception. The data shows China's capital and labor factors relative to output stayed remarkably steady.
So they weren't just throwing endless bodies and concrete at the problem.
No. That hypergrowth was driven almost entirely by TFP exploding. Their A variable went off the charts. They moved resources out of inefficient state agriculture and into highly efficient private manufacturing.
It was a perfectly healthy, balanced growth path. So what happened to Mexico's recipe? They had foreign capital, they had a young workforce.
It is a tragedy. Since 1985, Mexico's TFP plummeted below the zero axis. It went negative.
Wait, negative total factor productivity? Meaning they were actively getting worse at making things.
Exactly. Even with advanced foreign machinery and more workers, the total output they generated from those inputs decreased. The overall efficiency of the nation was locked in the basement.
The raw ingredients were there, but the kitchen was an absolute chaos. So why did their recipe break just as they were modernizing?
Well, whenever an economy stalls this badly, everyone loves to find a villain. There's a very common set of scapegoats that academics usually blame for Mexico's broken recipe.
Right, the false culprits. Usually everyone points at the Mexican financial system and the legal courts.
Because right as NAFTA launched in '94, Mexico had the tequila crisis. The peso collapsed, and the domestic banking sector was essentially wiped out.
Meaning domestic credit dried up. Young, innovative companies couldn't get loans to grow. And then on top of that, their bankruptcy courts were a mess.
A total mess. It was incredibly hard to liquidate a failing business. So the economy got clogged up with these zombie companies.
Just dying, inefficient firms hoarding capital and surviving because the courts couldn't cleanly kill them off. Plus, terrible contract enforcement. It sounds like a perfect explanation for why productivity would drop below zero.
It sounds flawless. Until you look back at China, Kehoe and Ruhl point out a massive plot hole in this theory.
Are we really pretending China in the 1990s was a beacon of efficient banking and flawless rule of law?
Exactly. By Western standard, China's institutions were a total disaster back then. Their state-owned banks were loaded with non-performing loans.
They literally funneled the public savings directly into highly inefficient state-owned enterprises before they even joined the WTO.
And their legal system offered almost zero protection for private property or contracts. China's financial and legal systems were just as bad, if not worse, than Mexico's.
This is such a mind-blowing realization. You cannot blame inefficient banks and bad courts for stopping Mexico when China achieved hypergrowth with the exact same terrible system.
Right. The banks are a problem, sure, but they aren't the fatal disease. To find the real structural rot, we have to look at specific sectors inside Mexico.
Okay, let's lift the hood. Because NAFTA wasn't a universal failure, was it?
No, not at all. For the tradable sector, the industries that manufacture physical goods you can ship across a border, it was a massive success.
Like machinery, computing, precision instruments.
Yes. Their TFP skyrocketed. They had to compete globally, so they adopted new tech and got highly efficient.
They figured out the recipe. So if manufacturing was humming along, what was the anchor dragging the whole country down?
The non-tradable sector.
Okay, so services and utilities that have to be produced and consumed locally. You can't import a highway or a power grid.
Exactly. In
Yeah.
Mexico, these sectors were highly monopolized and heavily protected. Think about the state-owned giant Pemex in oil extraction, or electricity, completely state-controlled.
And telecommunications, even after they privatized it, it was just a massive monopoly with zero domestic competition. Same with domestic trucking and rail.
Because they were shielded from foreign competition, they had absolutely no incentive to modernize. Their TFP remained abysmal.
Ah, I see. So you have this hyper-efficient manufacturing sector, but it's tethered to a profoundly inefficient domestic infrastructure.
Right. Every world-class Mexican factory still had to buy expensive electricity from a state monopoly. They had to pay exorbitant telecom fees and rely on bloated trucking networks to get their goods to the border.
It's like a massive invisible tax on every productive business. You can have the best robotics in the world, but if your energy and shipping costs are double what they should be, your global competitiveness is just erased.
The monopolies strangled the tradable sector. Mexico opened its external borders, but left its internal monopolies completely untouched.
They invited the world to a race, but forced their own runners to wear weighted vests.
That's the structural disease. But wait, we have to address the elephant in the room again. Because China has massive state monopolies too.
Right. China's telecoms, energy grids, heavy infrastructure, they're all completely dominated by the state. Why did China's monopolies anchor their economy the way Mexico's did?
To answer that, we have to pull back and look at the actual physics of economic development. Kehoe and Ruhl utilize a framework called the catch-up theory, developed by Parent and Prescott.
The catch-up theory. This introduces a really counterintuitive idea. The poorer you are, the faster you can sprint, even with heavy weights tied to your ankles.
It all revolves around the global technological frontier. The frontier is the absolute bleeding edge of human knowledge and efficiency. And for over 100 years, the United States has essentially defined that frontier.
Yeah, if you look at a chart of U.S. real GDP per working age person from 1900 to 2000, it's almost eerie. Despite world wars, the Great Depression, the Internet Revolution, it's just a straight line.
A shockingly stable growth rate of about 2% per year. That 2% is the natural speed limit of pure human invention.
Because if you're at the frontier, you can't copy anyone. You have to literally invent the microchip, sequence the genome, create new management theories from scratch.
And inventing the future is incredibly slow and expensive. You're hacking through an unmapped jungle with a machete, hence 2% growth.
But if you're a developing nation, say China in 1985, you are miles behind the guy with the machete.
You're deep in the jungle.
Yeah.
But you have one massive structural advantage. You don't have to invent anything.
The path is already cleared. The blueprints already exist.
Copying is exponentially cheaper and faster than inventing. You don't research semiconductor physics. You just buy the fab plant. You don't invent containerized shipping. You just replicate the network.
This is the copying dividend. Your growth velocity is tied directly to your distance from the frontier. When you start from extreme poverty, just adopting basic mid-century tech yields explosive hyperspeed growth.
And that forward momentum is so powerful, it easily masks massive institutional rot.
So you can sprint with weights on your ankles because you're running down a paved, steeply declining hill. China's 8% growth wasn't a flawless new system. It was the mathematical benefit of starting from the bottom.
Exactly. The copying dividend overpower the bad banks and the monopolies. The skeptics might say, well, maybe Mexico is just inherently incapable of growth.
But we can prove that's false by looking at Mexico's own history, because here is the ultimate anti-common sense fact. Mexico already had its China-style miracle.
Yes, people forget this. From 1953 to 1981, Mexico grew at a blistering 3.8% per year.
Almost double the U.S. frontier speed limit.
They were deep in the jungle back then. They ran their own catch-up sprint, urbanizing and adopting existing tech.
But mathematically, a catch-up sprint has an expiration date, right? The faster you run, the closer you get to the guy with the machete.
And when you close that gap, the paved path runs out. By the 80s, Mexico was a middle-income country. The cheap, easy copying dividend dried up.
You can't just move a farmer into a factory anymore. Your factories are already built. Now they have to become world-class innovators.
And that is exactly when the weights on your ankles become fatal. When you're running downhill, a bloated state oil monopoly is just an annoyance. But when you hit the flat ground near the frontier, those monopolies become lethal anchors.
So Mexico's tragedy was terrible timing. When they did the 90s reforms, they were already too close to the frontier to rely on the copying dividend. Copying didn't work anymore. Their bad monopolies actively hurt them now.
They needed high-level efficiency, but left the non-tradable monopolies intact. So the institutional rot finally caught up with them.
The apertura opened the windows, but the foundation of the house was still rotting. Which brings us to a frankly terrifying realization about today.
Right. If distance from the frontier dictates growth, and getting closer to the frontier exposes your institutional rot, what does that mean for China?
The unstoppable economic juggernaut of today might be the cautionary tale of tomorrow. Let's compare their actual wealth levels.
In 2008, after 25 years of hypergrowth, China's real GDP per working-age person was only $7,986.
And Mexico, the poster child for 2 decades of stagnation.
Mexico was at $20,755.
Wow. So even after being totally stuck in the mud, the average Mexican worker was still producing almost 3 times as much economic value as the Chinese worker.
China was only at 38.5% of Mexico's wealth level.
That's why China could sprint through the 90s and 2000s despite their terrible institutions. They were still incredibly far away from the U.S. frontier. They had a vast ocean of copying dividend left.
But that ocean is finite. As China gets richer and transitions to a firm middle-income country, their growth velocity has to decelerate toward that 2% iron law.
And when that momentum slows down, those highly inefficient state-owned enterprises, the bad banks, the opaque legal system, those weights are going to become impossibly heavy.
If China doesn't initiate massive, painful, politically dangerous structural reforms to dismantle their internal monopolies, the exact reforms Mexico failed to do, they are on a direct collision course with a Mexico-style cliff.
They'll hit the middle income wall. The copying dividend vanishes, Total factor productivity collapses under the state inefficiencies, and they face their own lost decades.
History shows us that all catch-up nations eventually have a hard landing on efficiency and institutions, from Western Europe to Japan and to Mexico.
This totally rewrites how you should read global financial news. When you see a developing nation posting 8% growth, don't just assume they have a magical government.
Right. You have to ask, how far are they from the 2% frontier? If they're starting from poverty, it's just the gravitational pull of the copying dividend.
The real test is what happens when the road flattens out, when you can't copy anymore, but you have to start inventing.
Which leads to a final, really provocative question for us to mull over today.
Yeah, we've established the U.S. sets the frontier at a steady 2% based on pure invention. But what happens if the frontier itself slows down?
Or even more radically, what happens if a catch-up nation like China doesn't just crash, but actually tries to overtake the frontier?
What does an economy look like when it can no longer rely on top-down copying, but has to transform into the chaotic, decentralized sole engine of global invention?
It's an economic metamorphosis that history has rarely seen on such a massive scale. Can a system built for replication survive the transition to original creation?
It's a massive question, and it just goes to show the blueprint for growth isn't universal. It depends entirely on where a nation stands relative to the edge of human progress.
Exactly. You have to look past the raw numbers and examine the structural foundations beneath the headlines.
Huge thanks to everyone for joining us on this exploration of the invisible forces shaping our world. Keep questioning the consensus, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.